Alright guys, Murph's here, and today at viewer request I want to discuss low power variable optics, or LPVOs. I want to go over their definition. I want to discuss some of their pros and cons, give some of my recommendations, both personal and then just by general category, and then do a little bit of comparison before everything's said and done. Alright, so with that, why don't we go ahead and define what a low power variable optic is. A LPVO is an optic that has a low end, a adjustable magnification optic that has a low end power of 1 and a high end power of up to 10. Generally, it goes in even numbers of 4, 6, 8, and 10, though there is, like, I believe Trijicon has a 1 to 5 option out there. So, for example, we have this SIG Tango 1 to 6 power optic. Now, if we look at this, this is very typical of features that you see in LPVO. So we have a more or less uniform shape to our tube. We do not have the large objective like we might see on like a 3 to 9 by 40 or something along those lines. And the whole point here is to keep this lighter, I guess I should say, and lower to the bore. So when you start putting on those wider objective housings, you have the weight of the glass as well as the weight of the material that goes into making that bell. That adds weight to the overall optic, and these are supposed to be more tactically minded optics. In addition to that, it's going to increase the height over bore, which for a tactically minded optic, potentially being used to engage at close range distances, that's not necessarily the best overall option. When you're talking about shooting at 5, 7, 10, 15 meters, already even with this type of optic, you have a higher height over bore. You add in that objective bell that you have to now take into account, and that can really complicate those types of engagements. In addition to that, the advantage of that objective bell is that it gathers more light, and this is advantageous if you're shooting at greater distances and you need more of that light to be able to get to your eyes so that you have a clearer picture of what it is that you're shooting at. But also if you're in a hunting type situation, you're getting into some low light conditions, you're still gathering the most light you can to be able to identify your target. Now, stuff like that can also be remedied with appropriate glass, but like glass clarity, having good high quality glass in there to begin with. But you pair that with good light gathering and then you have a really sharp picture at that point. These optics are not optimized in that manner. And this is where the kind of conscious trade-off comes in at that point. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers the definition portion of this. Why don't we go ahead and get into the pros and cons of these types of optics. The pros are that you can dial your optic down to 1 power and then dial it up to 6 power in order to be able to fight from close to long range should you need to do so, and be able to do so rather rapidly. A lot of these optics either come with or can be paired with fast throw levers like the one we just saw on this particular optic, in order to be able to quickly dial between those different magnifications. That is the stated pro of these types of optics. Now, the con, in my opinion, is weight. Because no matter what, between the glass, between the steel is utilized in the housing of the scope itself, as well as the mounts, this optic is going to weigh more. And this kind of comes back to the conscious trade-off type thing. Not all lightweight things are good, not all heavy things are bad type of deal. Weight is an incredibly subjective consideration. What one person might find to be too heavy, another person might find to be perfectly suitable for their needs. It's all about how it is that you appraise different features. Now, of course, when you're sitting around planning a build or planning to accessorize a rifle, weight is a difficult thing to be able to really understand up until you start getting it. You first off get the rifle equipped, and then second off actually start utilizing it and have a feel and an understanding for how that weight is impacting your ability to be able to work around the rifle. Very subjective thing. I'm not telling you to make your decisions based solely on weight. What I am saying is that weight is a consideration. Even if you don't place a very high concern around weight, it's still something that you have to keep considered at the end of the day before you wind up with a 20-pound rifle with all the accessories that you decide to throw on it. There's good and bad accessories. There are things that are good while being lightweight. There are some things that you might grade as needing to be more durable. It's all individual at that point. All right, guys, that's the pros and cons of these types of optics. Why don't we go ahead and get into a kind of contextual discussion about LPVOs. So there are some things that have come out, like some I guess, trends in thinking, because the firearm community is absolutely subjective to trend style thinking, that have come out in the past couple of years that I was kind of confused by. First off, the realization that 1 power on your LPVO is not true 1 power. Apparently this was some like mind-melting reality. It came out a couple of years. First person I saw really bring it up was Lucas Botkins of T-Rex Arms. He made a video and happened to mention that, like, hey, your 1 power is not true 1 power. And then like everybody's brains melted and they're just like, oh no, my 1 power is not a true 1 power. I thought this was common knowledge when like LPVOs were first coming out and stuff like that. They were becoming very popular optics. I did my research on LPVOs, and that was like one of the first things that I read about them, was that the 1 power was not true 1 power. It's 1.1, 1.25, whatever. It's less than 2, but it's not actual 1 power. And the reality is that you have at least 2 lenses in this thing, so it's going to be more than 1 power regardless. You run into the same type of thing, and maybe I'm about to melt some brains here, but it's the same kind of thing whenever it is that you're talking about closed emitter red dots. Technically not 1 power. And all that really impacts is parallax. So another thing that might not necessarily be well known is things like an Aimpoint Comp M2 has parallax out to like 50, has like parallax as a consideration out to like 50 yards. After that, parallax is no longer a concern. It's going to be the same thing with your 1 power option in your LPVO. The thing is, at the distances that you're probably engaging with, either A, a red dot, or B, the 1 power on your LPVO, are pretty close range to where parallax is not really a consideration. So, I don't know why this was a surprise. I mean, it kind of shows me that a lot of people don't really do any research past like industry talking points, which is kind of sad, but it's not that big of a deal. A lot of people make it out, for a very short period of time, people were making this out to be like the most earth-shattering of revelations, but it really doesn't impact anything overall. All right, so 1 power isn't actually 1 power, not that big of a deal. What about your in-betweens? Because a lot of people seem to train around their rifles being at 1 power, and then it's up to the highest power whenever it is that they need to take a longer shot. And there is a utility that's associated with that. Trying to sit there and go, yes, I am actively being shot at. I think this needs 4 power instead of 6 is probably not something you're necessarily going to do in the heat of the moment. However, not everything is based around tactical applications. So another thing that T-Rex Arms did was, I remember years ago he showed a video of him shooting a course of fire where he dialed his optic up to 3. Because that was a good distance in which he was going to be able to quickly rotate from target to target, or move from target to target, but still be able to accurately engage those targets. In my opinion, that's kind of gamesmanship, but that's not a bad thing in this case. If you're talking about like competition shooting or something along those lines where you know the course of fire beforehand and you can go ahead and set up your optic accordingly, that's pretty handy. Especially if you have like a rollover optic or something like that that you can move to. But, you know, let's say that for a portion of the course of fire, you have targets at a greater distance that you want 4 power, and then you are either going to dial it down to 1 or you're going to go to a rollover optic so that you can then go back to those longer distance targets, or perhaps dial up to even further distance targets. Whatever it is that you need to do, you have options. You have flexibility built into the optic at that point. And you can get it optimal for what it is that you're trying to do. Getting away from the competition type sense of things if you get into like a combat sense. So not everything has to be done at that higher power. You can use a lower power in order to be able to glass an area that isn't necessarily as far away. And as you open your field of view, you're going to better be able to pick out somebody moving or muzzle flashes or something along those lines. So then you can then dial into that target or just engage at the magnification that you're already able to identify it at, because you can very clearly see it and start popping in those shots at that point. So there is some utility in having that range of power between 1 and whatever your top end is. Okay, so what about the high-end power and stuff like that? What are the considerations for that? Well, the rule of thumb whenever it comes to magnification is that you want 1 power for every 100 yards that you're shooting. Now, guys, I've shot red dots out to 550 meters and made hits. I've shot them out to 400 and made very consistent hits. The 550 was a little touch and go. There's a lot that goes into that. However, that does not mean that red dots are necessarily 550 meter capable engagement, and that's not in their capable engagement envelope, because identification is a huge portion of this. So yes, if I set a target on a hill and have it be a different color than its background, it's going to be easier to hit than somebody who doesn't want to be shot, is wearing camouflage, and is trying to utilize cover at 550 meters. I'm going to have trouble picking out a head-sized target at that distance without it being silhouetted. So really, in that instance, I think whenever we're talking about power to distance, what we're really looking for is what you're able to identify, because you can only shoot what you can see. So yes, a 1 to 4 might be able to identify targets out to 400. It could possibly engage those targets further out given the right conditions, but if we're looking to actually be able to reliably identify, perhaps we're only looking at 400 meters. So on and so forth as you increase magnification with the different types of optics that you could be using. Okay, so that's kind of the rule of thumb. Those are the considerations that you may have there. That's our contextual discussion, with one more thing that I want to throw in there. So when you have all this ability to be able to dial between the different powers and stuff like that, this also changes your eye box. So at the lower 1x magnification, you have a much wider eye box than what you're necessarily going to find with a 6 power magnification at that point. What is eye box? Well, that's your ability to be able to move your eye around the rear of the optic through the ocular lens in order to be able to still see your target without like the black edging and all that kind of stuff, or less of the black edging and all that kind of stuff. Well, Murph, optimally, you want to keep the same cheek weld every time and all that kind of stuff, and you know, have the same placement and offset from your optics so that you have really accurate shots, right? Well, yes, absolutely. When you're in a static type range environment, zeroing your rifle or trying to shoot nice pretty groups and all that kind of stuff. But if we're talking about tactical application, you want cover. And cover might compromise that cheek to stock weld. Cover might compromise your ability to really get comfortable behind the rifle. You might have to use positions like rollover prone or a lot of these other kind of wonky looking positions in order to be able to accurately engage with your rifle while remaining safe behind cover. So with that being the case, you want a little bit more of a forgiving eye box. You want to be able to dial down that magnification to perhaps a less optimal magnification for the oh my goodness, a less optimal magnification for the distance that you're trying to shoot. Oh man, I really wish I could dial up to just 6 power. It'd be really great if I could do that, and I'd be able to, hit this guy no problem, but I can't see through the optics, so I'm not gonna be able to hit him at all with that being the case. So I'm gonna dial it back to 3 power, and now look at that. I'm actually able to better view my target and start laying some shots in there. I think one of the important aspects of LPVOs and the conscious trade-off discussion is that these are not necessarily, in my opinion, built to be precision optics. You can get precision-minded LPVOs out there, but I think it's kind of a mischaracterization of the use. The idea here is that you have enough optical clarity and magnification to be able to pick out where an opponent is and then start laying in shots. So with that kind of being the discussion overall, how do I characterize this use? What are my recommendations? Do I recommend LPVOs for duty type use? Absolutely. Absolutely, for both military and law enforcement, because both gain an advantage from being able to have that higher end magnification to be able to observe, let alone engage. So, and this might be surprising to say in conjunction with a police officer, because we generally think of police involved shootings being very close. But if we're talking about some sort of standoff type situation with the suspect, a police officer needs as much information as they can get. So is this guy armed? Is this guy perhaps trying to conceal something of one form or another on his person or in his immediate area and all that kind of stuff? Magnification helps out with that. The same type of thing with police snipers. Snipers in a civilian type sense don't generally take shots over 60 yards. That doesn't mean they don't need high magnification in order to be able to properly read and understand the situation to take a very high intensity single precise shot. So there's a lot of stuff that plays into that. So police absolutely benefit from that higher end magnification. In the military, if you're talking about, depending on the situation, really any situation is not hampered by greater magnification. So if you're talking about like counterinsurgency type stuff like the US military was doing for the last 20 years, being able to assess a potential threat. Does this person have a weapon? Do they have a suicide vest on? Is that disturbed earth down the road actually sketchy? Is there something hidden in this junk, in this trash over here, whatever it is that's going on? being able to take that information and process it so that you can figure out how best to be able to go about the situation. In addition to that, when you're talking about like the fighting in Ukraine right now, a lot of trench warfare and all that kind of stuff, because as it turns out, when you're in a situation where you don't have a lot of natural cover, you have to start making your own. And that's when foxholes slowly become trenches, because position improvement never ceases, and you want to go ahead and just start connecting all these different positions so you're not exposing yourself moving about your daily duties. So in trench type warfare, you're just trying to shoot at somebody's head. And it doesn't take very long for a head-sized target to not only be very difficult to identify, but also very difficult to hit. Like 200 meters could make a head-sized target very difficult to be able to hit at that point, especially for someone who doesn't want to get shot in the forehead. So LPVOs are very advantageous in that case, and we have seen LPVOs show up in Ukraine in some of the footage that we've seen from that fighting. So if I were to really characterize like the combat use of an LPVO, it would be like in a, you're getting ready to take a town or a village or something along those lines. So you can go ahead and get in there and start doing your recce, and you can use your LPVO in order to be able to glass the area and figure out, all right, where is the enemy moving? Where have they potentially got like machine gun positions set up? Is that a command post over there? Are civilians over here? And all that kind of stuff. And then as you move into the objective, as you're moving down the streets, you can have your optic dialed appropriately to whatever magnification it is that you need in order to be able to scan windows or down alleyways or whatever, further down the street, whatever, it doesn't really matter. You can scale that magnification in order to be able to start finding muzzle flashes, finding where someone's moving, and being able to pinpoint and start laying rounds onto that particular target. And then as you move into houses and buildings and stuff like that, doing house-to-house fighting, you can dial it down to 1x to be able to clear rooms. And then since house-to-house fighting implies that people in two different houses are fighting each other, you can then get to a window and dial up magnification in order to be able to shoot outside of the building, down streets, down whatever, in order to be able to keep fighting and suppressing the enemy, perhaps suppressing the next position and all that kind of stuff. So LPVO, fantastic in this type of application. This will feed into our conclusions coming up here shortly. So what about self-defense, home defense type applications? I am less interested in LPVO in home defense, self-defense type situations. Mostly because if you have to dial up your magnification, you're probably going to have a hard time convincing somebody else that you needed to take that long distance self-defense shot. A jury of your peers may not necessarily side with you on that particular decision. Now, if you were to tell me that this is your life and liberty gun, so this is the gun that you're going to grab if the Russians start falling out of the sky, plus, and since you don't, for some reason, feel a need to own a bunch of different rifles, each one optimized for a singular purpose, then yeah, I understand your life and liberty gun having a 1-to-6, and you understanding that you're probably just going to be, if you have to use it in a home defense situation, using it at 1 power. And that's not to say that I haven't had a life and liberty gun set aside for that exact same type of purpose. Just saying that at that point we're looking more at duty type features as opposed to home defense, things that I would optimize for home defense. If we're talking about home defense, I'm thinking more in terms of like red dots. Okay, well, what about competition? Well, I think we talked about the competition aspect of this pretty thoroughly earlier. Aside from PRS, I think LPVOs are absolutely fantastic for self-defense type not self-defense, for competition type things. 2-gun, 3-gun, doesn't really matter. Whatever type of competition that encourages you to utilize a rifle, you will probably at some point benefit from having an LPVO. Okay, Murph, what about hunting type applications? I think it depends on the type of hunting that you're doing. If you're doing some sort of fast target acquisition hunting, which in my opinion in this case would be like hog hunting, then yes, I think an LPVO is very advantageous. If you're talking about hunting elk or hunting, deer and stuff like that, I think you're better suited with a medium to high power variable optic, depending on how far it is that you're planning on taking your shots. At that point, I'm putting a higher emphasis on the light gathering capability of those optics, should I be getting into low light shooting conditions, as well as something that's better suited to actual long range engagements. We'll get into that more here in a little bit. All right, guys, those are my general recommendations. What about my own personal recommendations? What do I look for in an LPVO? Well, so when I'm grading LPVOs, when I look at like a 1:4, I could put a 1:4 on a 16-inch gun and that would just be fine, or that would be just fine. And at one point, like 1:4s were very popular LPVOs very early on in like the development of LPVOs. However, they've been kind of superseded by quite a bit of technological advancement since then. In my opinion, an LPVO would be about, or a 1:4 power LPVO would be about the most powerful thing that I would put on like an SPR. Something in like the maybe 11.5 to 13.5 range. Probably more like 12.5 to 13.5. Something that's probably a little bit more magnification than the actual distance that I'm going to engage to, but I do want the greater magnification for observation capability and all that kind of stuff. When it comes to 1:6s paired with like a 5.56 gun, I think a 16-inch gun is a perfectly acceptable choice at that point. The 5.56 is effective out to 550, 600. You could do that with a 16-inch gun, and especially with the appropriate ammunition being selected for that type of purpose. So, I've got the two optics. As I mentioned before, I have this SIG Tango 1:6x24 on this DD M4A1 RIS3, previously reviewed on the channel. As well as this, oops, this thing's in the way. As well as this TrueGlow Omnia 6 on this Spikes lower with a CBC upper. It's my original go-to rifle, which if you're interested in that, it's one of the earliest videos on the channel, link in the description. So these I have paired with 16-inch guns. I think these are absolutely fantastic application for the 16-inch gun. Now, 1:8s and 1:10s, that's getting into really heavy optics at that point. So I'm looking at more dedicated distance guns at that point, less so guns that I might be willing to move or flex into closer range type fighting applications. This is getting into like, in common parlance and some of the terminology that we've come up with in the past couple of years, this is a GPR, I guess. I don't know, I just call it a fighting rifle. But I could see a 16-inch recce rifle wearing a 1:8, maybe a 1:10, probably more like a 1:6 to 1:8, somewhere in that kind of transitional period. And for me, I have a whole video on recce versus SPR versus DMR, so if you're interested in that, go ahead and check out the link in the description. But that's kind of a weird middle ground, because like I think I'd want to see a heavier barrel on a 16-inch recce rifle, whereas as we get into an SPR, we're still talking about like a 5.56 round. I'm not necessarily getting out that far, so I might want to go with a more precision-minded optic with the larger objective bell and all that kind of stuff, less so than an LPVO. But if we change caliber, if we start talking about like some 6.5 Grendels, some 6.8 SPC, or some 308, then that kind of changes my overall appraisal of that, because I have that greater range associated with it. So when it comes to 1:10s, I could see that going on a DMR. I could see a 1:8 going on a DMR as well. Probably not a 5.56 gun, probably in one of those other calibers, and most definitely a 308 and a 1:10 on like a SCAR Heavy. That would make a lot of sense to me. Okay, so that's kind of how I evaluate LPVOs. Getting into the comparison aspect here, how do I grade an LPVO against different types of optics? Like, let's say red dots. Long-time viewers of the channel know that I'm a huge fan of red dots. I've mentioned my comfort level with red dots already previously here in this video. Red dots are going to be lighter than LPVOs in every way that you can think of it. Even the largest red dot with the bulkiest possible mount is going to be lighter than the lightest LPVO. The technology has not gotten to that point where LPVOs can effectively challenge red dots in weight. So if you're in a situation where you're going to be shooting close range anyway, you might evaluate wanting to stick with a red dot as opposed to going with an LPVO. If you don't really have a long range requirement, why would you necessarily want to hop on an LPVO at that point when you could just have the lighter weight red dot that actually pairs to your use and requirements at that point? Okay, well, what about red dots with a magnifier? All right, so I have changed my opinion over the years when it comes to red dots and magnifiers. Professionally, I've utilized red dots and magnifiers, and I've kind of like gone back and forth across them over the years. At one point, I absolutely despised red dots with magnifiers. I have since lightened up on that, and I have found some use for red dots and magnifiers. With red dots and magnifiers, Yeah, it's super great because you have your 1X and then you can go ahead and jump it to 4 power, 6 power. And this kind of actually gets in the LCAN as well, which is not necessarily a red dot, but it has that same binary switch option where I have 1 power and then I have some sort of magnification, 4, 6, whatever. So that's really great, but you have nothing in between to dial. So if your magnification is too little or too much, you don't really have another option in between. So that's something you kind of have to take into account with magnifiers. Magnifiers are probably going to have, statistically, being at a lower power than what you can do with a lot of LPVOs, they're probably going to have a better eye box, so that may be very advantageous to you if you're expecting to be fighting around a lot of cover and stuff like that. But if you're trying to optimize for longer distance engagements, I don't know of magnifiers where I'm jumping to. Magnifiers have an application, and LPVOs have a magnification, but I think they're a little divergent in where their magnification comes in at. So with red dots and magnifiers, I'm doing a lot of close range stuff, you know, and then I might have to shoot out to 300 yards at some point. LPVOs, I'm doing a lot of close, I might be doing some close range stuff, but I most definitely expect that I'll be shooting out to 300 or 400 meters quite a bit. Maybe that's where I want to go with an LPVO as opposed to a red dot magnifier. Now, red dot magnifier is probably going to be lighter though. So again, there's like the perfect example of that conscious trade-off there. How do I need, man, I'm really having trouble being able to see the distance I need to with this red dot and magnifier, but I think a little bit more magnification with an LPVO and a lot more flexibility in the system is what I need. So I'm going to go ahead and accept the weight. That is that dynamic in action. All right, well, what about like fixed power optics like ACOGs or prismatic optics? A lot of this conversation is going to primarily focus around the ACOG because that's what I have a lot of experience with when it comes to fixed magnification optics. The ACOG is a very durable and capable very durable and capable optic. I am not the biggest fan. I have a lot of experience with ACOGs. I've shot them quite extensively. And while they're great if you're kind of living in that 100 to 300 meter engagement area, I don't really think they do good elsewhere. So a lot of, like, especially Marines will go on about like the bend and aiming concept or method or whatever it is. And I have a lot of trouble employing that method. I don't find it to be that helpful. Some people do experience a certain amount of offset with the reticle with both eyes open. That does not give them the most accurate style of shooting. So I've never really gotten the bend and aiming method to work all that well for me. I think it's kind of, honestly, I think it's overhyped. If you're living at those not even greater, those intermediate distances, 50, like, an ACOG is kind of good. It's acceptable at 50, and, it's really good at 100 and 200, and it's good enough at 300 and stuff like that. And that's pretty much it. You also don't have very forgiving eye boxes on the ACOG, so if you're doing any type of more dynamic, suboptimal styling of shooting, it's really not going to be that helpful to you. I cannot necessarily speak to the longevity of prismatic optics, but any fixed magnification optic is going to be more durable than an LPVO. So I kind of, again, conscious trade-off, take the good with the bad. Now, someone's going to hop in the comments section and be like, yeah, but you can like put, an RMR, stacked on top of your ACOG. And I never understood why that was ever popular to begin with and recently came back into popularity. Stacked red dots are so high above bore. It strikes me as silly. Never was my thing. If that's your thing, sure, it's kind of the same idea of like the red dot and magnifier type thing, just kind of in reverse. You're primarily using your magnified optic and then you pop up to your red dot. I would sooner see a rollover type red dot utilized with an ACOG than a stacked optic. That's just my own personal preference. All right, what about like medium and high powered optics? Getting away from the LPVOs and into the MPVOs and HPVOs. Those, if you're getting into precision type matches, those are the overall option. If you're trying to build out a rifle to be better capable at the longer distances, that's where you plan on living, those are better options. So taking this Mark 12 MOD Murph, previously reviewed and update reviewed on the channel, links in the description. I have a 2-7x32 Crossfire 2 optic on this with the dead hold reticle, right? This is a very simple reticle, and the whole idea here was to have something that was very simplistic, that I could work in at close ranges if I wanted to, and still be able to make shots out to 600, which is kind of the envelope of a Mark 12 to begin with. So I have this offset red dot, which I can do one of two things with. If I have this dialed up real high and then I have a close target, I can roll over onto my red dot and be able to take out that target. As well as if I'm doing some distance, if I'm like glassing and trying to find an opponent, and then I find my target, I can then rotate my magnified optic onto that target at that point and start that engagement that way. So that kind of helps with like the glassing type concept there. Also, the 2-power option on this has a surprisingly forgiving eye box and is actually not bad at close range type engagements. So if I was already on 2, I would feel no need to go to this SIG Romeo 5 red dot. Now, if I'm on 7, yeah, at that point I'm going to go ahead and roll over. But if I'm already starting out on 2, it's really not that bad to be able to engage with. It kind of surprised me when I first started evaluating this rifle after I put it together. I just wanted a small, lightweight optic that would be effective out to 600 meters. Now, if you're talking, again, hunting and all those types of things, I want the greater light gathering, and then I also want a especially if we're talking like PRS and stuff like that, I want something with a lot of sub-10s. You can get very busy reticles and LPVOs, but I think that goes against the overall concept. You can get sub-10s in red dots to be able to utilize with your rollover optic. I used an EOTech XPS4 professionally with a magnifier, and without the magnifier, those 4 dots inside of that reticle are just a smear. It's just a line. It's not very helpful. But when you bring that magnifier over, you can clearly make out the dots. Now, those dots are graduated out to distances that I really wouldn't want to take a 5.56 round without some wind holdovers, and you don't really have that in the EOTech reticle. But it is meant to be very pared down for you to be able to quickly acquire targets. In my opinion, LPVOs should have a little bit more data in them. They should give you some wind holds or some holds to be able to, associate with like a running target or something along those lines, and some drop capabilities, some sub-10s in that manner. But they don't necessarily need a lot of that stuff. When I see really busy reticles, I put that over to precision type reticles. So like Night Force makes an LPVO that has like every 10 meters laid out in a sub-10. That's way too much data. That is far too confusing to the eye for an optic that I don't think is appropriately paired for that. As opposed to if you put that on a 4-16 by 42 or 50 or something along those lines, you would be able to better get something out of those reticles, out of those sub-10s and all that kind of stuff, and wind holdovers and all that kind of thing. All right, guys, that's comparisons. What are my conclusions when it comes to LPVOs? How do I rate them, or how do I conceptually view them overall? LPVOs are fantastic tactical optics that are not meant to do everything well, but a lot of things pretty good. So they're great in 1 power. They are okay at their higher magnification levels. So when you consider that they don't have as much light gathering capability, and so with even the clearest of glass, they're not going to be as good as something with a wider objective bell. Let's say that you're taking fire from somebody 600 meters away. You've got this rifle, someone's shooting at you at 600. You may not necessarily be able to make them out and be able to take this super precise shot, but you can at least read the muzzle flashes and maybe make out their outline, and then start being able to lay rounds in there, which makes them then have to rethink their life, because they thought they could just engage you with impunity, and now all of a sudden you're laying rounds in on them. They've got to move, or they've got to somehow win this exchange of fire with you in order to be able to keep on living. And that complicating their worldview at that point is just as important as if you took them with the first shot. Because if we're talking about tactical type application, especially in a military type sense, rifles don't necessarily win battles. Combined arms wins battles. Synchronized fires wins battles. Rifles are a portion of that, but they're not the only portion of that. This is to be able to close distance. So it's not important that that rifleman, like if he can take out that fighter at 600, sick, dude. There's probably a whole other platoon of guys, though, that now know that we're fighting and are now seeking cover and all that kind of stuff. And the rifle is no longer as applicable as opposed to mortars or howitzers or whatever else. We're kind of getting down a rabbit hole here, so I'm going to dial myself back. So, fantastic for the average application, with some notable limitations that you just have to take the good with the bad with. That is my overall assessment of the LPVO. All right, guys, I think this pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.